Open your pantry right now. Actually picture it wherever you are. A few cans, maybe some pasta, a half-used bag of chips, something in the back you forgot you bought. Now I want you to picture a different pantry. Your grandmother's, or maybe your great-grandmother's, in 1955. Same word, pantry, completely different room. Hers wasn't a place where food waited to be remembered. It was a small, organized, almost sacred part of the house. And if you opened that door, you could tell, just from what was sitting on those shelves, exactly how that family lived, what they valued, and how hard that woman had worked all summer to make sure winter wouldn't catch them empty-handed. Here's the strange part. Most of what filled that pantry in 1955 isn't sold anymore. Not because nobody wants it, because almost nobody remembers to ask for it. Today we're going to open that door together, shelf by shelf, and I think by the end you're going to look at your own kitchen a little differently. Let's start with the thing that probably sat front and center on almost every shelf in America in 1955, and that's home-canned vegetables. Right around this time, canning at home was not a hobby, it was closer to a household duty, almost as routine as doing the laundry. A 1950s housewife, especially one with a garden out back or access to a farmer's market in late summer, would spend weeks in July and August putting up tomatoes, green beans, corn, peaches, anything that grew faster than the family could eat it fresh. By the time fall arrived, that pantry might hold 40, 50, sometimes over 100 jars, all labeled by hand, all representing hours of standing over a boiling water bath in a hot kitchen during the hottest months of the year. I find something almost moving about this when you actually sit with it. Those jars weren't just food. They were proof. Proof that the family had planned ahead. Proof that nothing from the garden had gone to waste. And there was a quiet kind of pride in a full shelf of canned tomatoes. The same way there's pride today in, I don't know, a clean house or a paid-off car. It meant something. It said, this family is taken care of. Why did this disappear from most of our kitchens? A few reasons, and they're worth naming honestly. Supermarkets exploded in number through the 1950s and 60s, and they brought year-round produce that didn't depend on your own garden or your own labor. Home freezers became affordable and common, which meant freezing replaced a lot of what canning used to do, and freezing is simply less work. And maybe the biggest reason of all, fewer families kept a kitchen garden at all, once more people lived in suburbs with small yards instead of farms with big ones. The skill didn't vanish because it stopped working. It vanished because the life that needed it changed shape. If this kind of detail is the sort of thing you enjoy hearing about, go ahead and subscribe to Vintage Table USA now, because we open up a different part of American food history like this every single week. Next shelf. Lard. An entire tin or crock of it, usually rendered at home from a hog the family had raised, or bought whole from a local butcher. I want to be clear about something here, because I think it surprises people. Lard wasn't the backup option in 1955. It was often the main cooking fat in the house, used for frying, the pie crusts, for biscuits, for greasing a pan before baking. Butter was reserved, more often than not, for the table, for spreading on bread, while lard did the actual cooking. It was cheap. It kept for months without refrigeration if rendered properly, and home cooks swore that nothing made a pie crust flakier. What happened to it is a story about marketing as much as it is about health. Starting in the late 1950s and accelerating through the 60s and 70s, vegetable oil companies ran an enormous, sustained campaign positioning their products as the modern, clean, healthy alternative to old-fashioned animal fat. Whether or not every claim in those campaigns held up under later scientific scrutiny is its own complicated conversation, and there are nutritionists today who'd argue Grandma's crock of lard wasn't the villain it was made out to be. But the campaign worked. Within a generation, lard went from a kitchen staple to something people were almost embarrassed to admit they used. Now let's talk about something on that pantry shelf that I think really captures the entire spirit of 1955, and that's the coffee can full of bacon grease, sitting right next to the stove, not even hidden away in the pantry proper, because it got used that often. Every time bacon was fried, the grease went into that can instead of down the drain, and then it got used for everything. Frying eggs, sautéing vegetables, adding flavor to a pot of greens or beans, even, in some households, as the base for gravy. This wasn't considered strange or unsanitary, it was considered sensible. You had already paid for that flavor once when you bought the bacon. Why would you pour it away? This is the part of the story I personally find the most quietly impressive. There's a kind of respect for food in that grease can that we've mostly lost the habit of. Today, a lot of us cook with fresh oil from a fresh bottle every single time, and whatever fat is left on the pan just gets rinsed down the sink without a second thought. In 1955, that would have looked almost wasteful, maybe even a little careless. Nothing with flavor left in it got thrown away if there was any way to use it again. We're a good chunk of the way through this one now, and if you're finding any of this useful, or just genuinely interesting, a like on this video genuinely helps more people who care about real American food history find their way to this channel. Let's move to flour and cornmeal, because the sheer quantity of these two things in a 1955 pantry would probably shock most of us today. A family of 5 or 6 might keep a 25 or even 50-pound sack of flour on hand at a time, not because they were hoarding, but because almost everything started with flour. Bread, biscuits, gravy, pie crust, dumplings, pancakes, a thickener for nearly every stew on the stove. Baking from scratch wasn't a weekend hobby reserved for people who enjoyed it. It was simply how a household ate, full stop. Because store-bought bread, while it existed, was an expense a lot of tighter budgets skipped when flour and a hot oven could make the same thing for a fraction of the cost. Cornmeal held a similar position, especially in southern households, where cornbread, hush puppies, and a dozen other dishes ran on it constantly. A sack of cornmeal in the pantry wasn't a specialty item. It was as basic and assumed as a carton of milk is to us now. What changed wasn't that people stopped liking bread, it's that the economics and the rhythm of daily life shifted. Store-bought bread got cheap and convenient enough that the math no longer favored baking your own. Households got smaller. Women, in growing numbers, were working outside the home by the 1960s and 70s, which meant there simply wasn't the same stretch of afternoon available to spend on dough rising and a hot oven running for hours. The skill of baking from scratch didn't disappear because it lost its value. It disappeared because the time it required got harder and harder to find. There's one more item I want to spend real time on, because it might be the most overlooked thing on this entire shelf, and that's the family's stock of dried beans and peas. Navy beans, pinto beans, split peas, black-eyed peas, usually bought in bulk and kept in cloth sacks or large jars. These weren't exciting. Nobody in 1955 was posting about their bean soup, but they were there, every week, in nearly every kitchen, because dried beans did something almost nothing else on the shelf could do quite as well. They turned almost nothing into a real meal, and they kept, unspoiled, for a year or more without refrigeration. A pot of beans, started in the morning with a ham bone or a piece of salt pork, could feed a family through dinner and often through lunch the next day too. It asked very little of the budget and gave back a meal that actually filled people up. I think what's interesting is that beans never really disappeared from American cooking the way lard or bacon grease mostly did. They just slid quietly out of the center of the plate and into the side dish, while convenience foods, canned soups, and quick proteins took over the main spot at dinner. The beans are still around,
What's gone is the central role they used to play.
I want to step back for a second here, because I think there's a real risk when you talk about a pantry like this of making it sound like everything was simply better back then. And I don't actually believe that. And I don't think this channel should pretend to either. Keeping a pantry like this took an enormous amount of unpaid, physically demanding labor, almost entirely from women, and it left very little room for anything else. There was no real shortcut to canning 50 jars of tomatoes in a hot kitchen in August. There was no shortcut to rendering lard from a hog carcass, or kneading bread by hand 3 times a week. A lot of what we're calling charming today was, for the person actually doing it, simply exhausting. And many of these women would have welcomed a freezer, a supermarket, and a few less hours standing over a stove if you'd offered it to them at the time. So I don't think the honest takeaway here is that we should all go back to rendering our own lard. I think the honest takeaway is something a little more specific. That pantry represented a relationship with food where almost nothing was wasted, where flavor was treated as something worth saving rather than something to be tossed down the drain, and where a full shelf meant something real about how a family was doing. We gained a lot of convenience since 1955. I just don't think it's controversial to say we also lost a little bit of that instinct, the one that makes you pause before you throw something useful away. Before we get to the last shelf, there's one more thing worth pulling out from the back corner of that pantry, almost always pushed behind the jars where it wouldn't get knocked over. And that's the family's stash of root vegetables. Potatoes, onions, carrots, sometimes turnips or rutabagas, kept not in the refrigerator, because most households barely had room in one for much beyond milk and butter, but in a cool, dark corner of the pantry, or, even more often, in an actual root cellar dug beneath the house or out behind it. A root cellar in 1955 wasn't unusual, especially outside the bigger cities. It was simply where a family kept several months' worth of vegetables that didn't need refrigeration, just darkness and cool air, away from light that would make potatoes turn green and bitter. A well-stocked root cellar going into November could mean a family had vegetables sorted clear through to spring without spending another dime at a produce stand. There's something almost quietly impressive about that kind of planning. Buying or growing in the fall with the discipline to make it last 5 or 6 months without anything spoiling. What replaced it, more than anything else, was the supermarket produce aisle itself. Once a family could drive to a store any week of the year and buy a few potatoes and onions exactly when they needed them, the whole logic of stockpiling root vegetables stopped making sense. Why dig a cellar and manage inventory all winter when fresh produce was sitting under fluorescent lights 5 minutes away any day you wanted it? It's a perfectly reasonable trade. It's just a trade. And like every other item we've talked about today, it quietly erased a whole set of skills that nobody particularly mourned losing at the time. Because nobody back then could have known those skills would feel this distant just a few generations later. Here's what I keep coming back to when I think about all of this. Every single item on that 1955 shelf, the canned tomatoes, the lard, the grease can by the stove, the flour sack, the beans, disappeared from most of our kitchens for a reason that made sense at the time. Nobody woke up one day and decided convenience was bad and Grandma's pantry was good. Life just got faster, smaller, busier, and the pantry adjusted along with it, item by item, decade by decade, until one day, a kid stood in front of an empty cabinet and had no idea what a coffee can full of bacon grease was even for. I don't think the answer is guilt, and I really don't think it's pretending the past was simpler or easier, because for the person standing in that kitchen, it usually wasn't. But I do think there's something worth holding on to in that old habit of looking at food and asking, is there one more use left in this before I let it go? That question didn't need a pantry full of mason jars to still matter today. If your own grandmother or mother had a pantry like the one we just walked through, or if there's something specific you remember seeing on that shelf that we didn't mention today, I'd genuinely love to read about it in the comments. Stories like that are exactly what keep this channel grounded in something real instead of just guesswork. And if you want more of this, the kind of American food history that's actually researched and told honestly instead of dressed up for effect, subscribing to Vintage Table USA is the easiest way to make sure you don't miss what's coming next. There's a lot more sitting on these old shelves still waiting to be talked about. Thanks for spending this time with me. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.